It is February 16, 1959. Fidel Castro, at just 32 years old, becomes Prime Minister of Cuba. This is the first, but by no means the last, position he will hold. He will remain leader of the country for 49 years, becoming one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century. At this moment, millions of Cubans celebrate his election with enthusiasm. After years under his predecessor, the corrupt Fulgencio Batista, they hope for a better future. Castro wins supporters not only through his fight against imperialism under the slogan "Homeland or Death," but also through free healthcare and the eradication of illiteracy. However, the darker side of his rule will include one-party governance, censorship, and executions of political opponents. His push for socialism will also lead the island of freedom, as Cuba is often called, into economic collapse. Fidel Castro was born in 1926 to a wealthy plantation owner and his cook. Although he was an illegitimate child, he received the best possible education. At 16, he enrolled at the prestigious Jesuit college Belén in the capital, later studying law at the University of Havana. There he became interested in politics. Influenced by the ideas of Marx and Lenin, he joined the revolutionary movement of the time. Although Cuba had the third highest per capita income in Latin America at the time, social inequality was extreme. The country was a paradise for American investors and tourists, who flocked to Havana's bars, casinos, and brothels, while most rural inhabitants lived in wood and mud shacks, barely surviving in extreme poverty. In 1952, Dictator Fulgencio Batista returned to power. A corrupt politician, he ordered the execution of thousands of opponents. It was during this period that Castro, known as the lawyer of the poor, became one of the opposition leaders who stood up against Batista. Castro never feared violence in pursuit of his ideals. However, his first armed action ended in failure. On July 26, 1953, he organized an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, aiming to seize weapons. But the guards successfully repelled the assault, killing many of the attackers. Castro himself was captured and sentenced to 15 years in prison. 2 years later, Batista made a fatal mistake. He declared an amnesty, allowing Fidel Castro to go into Mexican exile. There, along with his brother Raúl, Argentine doctor Ernesto Che Guevara, and other Cuban revolutionaries, he began preparing for the final battle against the hated dictator. The revolution begins at the end of 1956. At 30 years old, Castro buys an old yacht named Granma from an American in the port of Tuxpan for $15,000. Along with 81 companions, he embarks on a 1,500-mile journey to the Cuban coast. After a week at sea, they land on December 2nd, 1956, south of Niquero, on the island's eastern side. But Batista's soldiers are already waiting and ambush them. Many revolutionaries are killed, but Fidel and a few others escape into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they remain for the next 2 years. Through armed skirmishes, his forces capture new weapons, and with his powerful rhetoric, he convinces more and more Cubans to join his cause. Over time, the guerrilla struggle grows into a mass uprising. Batista is furious, and by summer 1958, he loses patience with the rebellious Castro. He launches a large-scale military offensive, but it ends in complete failure. The United States, which had initially supplied Batista with weapons and aircraft, withdrew their support. At the time, President Eisenhower believes that Castro aims to create a better future for Cuba. On New Year's Eve 1958, Batista receives word from his troops that Santa Clara, a key city in central Cuba, has fallen. Realizing his time is up, he packs his bags and $300 million in cash, and just after midnight, flees the country. The first guerrilla units enter Havana on January 2nd, 1959. 6 days later, Cubans celebrate the arrival of Fidel Castro himself. At first, the new leader truly inspires hope for a better future. Across the country, he establishes over 10,000 new schools, raising the literacy rate to 98%. Reforms in healthcare lead to a decline in infant mortality. But the new order that most Cubans had dreamed of looks very different from what they had imagined. Castro begins consolidating his power through brutal means. In political trials, he sentences not only members of Batista's regime, but also many of his former compañeros to death or long prison terms.
Al esfuerzo y al heroísmo de una revolución, no los queremos, no los necesitamos.
Immediately after taking office, he starts building socialism in Cuba. He nationalizes foreign-owned property, implements a planned economy, and later issues a decree banning all political parties. Elections are first postponed for 18 months, and later indefinitely. The changes in Cuba provoked strong opposition, especially in the United States, as the nationalization primarily affected American companies. President Eisenhower banned the export of American goods to Cuba, except for medicine and certain food products. In January 1961, the United States severed diplomatic ties with Cuba, and a year later, they imposed a trade embargo on all commerce with the island nation. Fidel Castro's thinking was further shaped by an event that became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. In April 1961, under the leadership of newly elected President John F. Kennedy, US authorities supported an attempt by Cuban exiles to remove Castro from power. However, the operation ended in failure. Cuban armed forces, trained and supplied by communist bloc countries, crushed the invaders within 3 days. The failed attack also gave Castro an excuse to eliminate the remaining opposition. He sent 100,000 people to prison. Another escalation in the US-Cuba relations occurred in October 1962 during the Caribbean crisis, triggered by the deployment of US missiles in Turkey and the subsequent attempt to station Soviet nuclear warheads in Cuba. Although the attempt ultimately failed for the Soviet Union, the United States pledged not to invade the island. This, along with a massive influx of Soviet aid, allowed Castro to transform Cuba into a classic Soviet-style communist state. In 1976, at the age of 50, Castro approved a new constitution that enshrined the Communist Party of Cuba as the leading force in the country. In addition to his roles as Prime Minister and First Secretary of the Communist Party, he also assumed the position of President. By that time, the island's economy was in total collapse. Cubans faced shortages of basic necessities, most lived in absolute poverty, and in rural areas, people were dying of hunger. Yet Castro refused to acknowledge any mistakes in governing the country.
Estamos en periodo especial, un periodo difícil, un periodo uno de los más difíciles de nuestra historia. ¿Por qué? Porque no hemos tenido que quedar solos frente al imperio, solitos. ¿Y qué hacía falta para quedarse solos frente al imperio? Había falta unidad, pero hacía falta valor, hacía falta patriotismo, habría falta espíritu revolucionario. Un pueblo débil, un pueblo blandengue, un pueblo cobarde, se rinde y vuelve a la esclavitud. Pero un pueblo digno, un pueblo valiente como nosotros no se rinde y no vuelve jamás a la esclavitud.
In the mid-70s, Castro sought to satisfy his great power ambitions. At the end of 1975, he sent 40,000 Cubans to Angola to help keep the Marxist People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola in power. Soon, troops from the Island of Freedom were also active in Ethiopia, Libya, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Uganda. Castro firmly believed in the imminent victory of the revolution across the entire African continent. Cuba remained a peculiar communist nation with its capital just 100 miles from the southernmost point of the United States. But then came 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it, the complete downfall of Cuba's economy, which had depended on Soviet aid. Castro had no choice but to change course. His attempt to lift the US embargo failed, but he began attracting foreign investors and opened the island to Western tourism. Throughout the 90s, speculation grew about Castro's deteriorating health. In 1997, at the age of 71, he designated his brother Raúl as his future successor. 9 years later, in June 2006, he transferred key government powers to him. From that moment on, Castro rarely appeared in public. On November 25, 2016, at 90 years old, Fidel Castro died. It happened on the exact 60th anniversary of the start of the Communist Revolution in Cuba. It is a historical irony that the Grandma's departure from Mexico in 1956 shares the same date as Castro's death. Between those two events lie 60 years of struggle, bloodshed, and dictatorship, as well as the incredible story of how 81 men on an old boat conquered, ruled, and reshaped the largest island in the Caribbean.